later on. For now, we want to swiftly welcome the lady who will be giving us our opening remarks. Clara Enim has been a friend of PDA for several years. She is the program manager of the Volunteer Cooperation Program at the World University Service of Canada, that's WUSC Ghana. And she has helped the organization to work with several other firms in Ghana and outside of it, particularly focusing on gender equality and social inclusivity, focusing on the empowerment of vulnerable and marginalized groups of people. And so she is really well placed to speak to us about the importance of safeguarding. And we want to kick off our discussions today by hearing from her. So Clara, you're warmly welcome, and we are ready to hear what you have for us.
Thank you very much, Asida, and thank you everyone on the call. I'm very glad everyone is here, but let me just kickstart by saying that I would like to thank the organizers of this event, the key speakers that will be presenting as well, other development professionals on this call, and in fact, all protocols are duly observed. And once again, thanks to PDA for organizing such events. It gives me great delight indeed to welcome you all to the Mainstreaming Safeguarding Systems and Practices Within Organizations webinar. I am very happy to be part of this forum of experts to discuss safeguarding and various kinds of risks and dangers within organizations. Safeguarding is the creation of a safe and welcoming environment where everyone is respected, protected, and valued. It is about making sure that the organization is run in a way that actively prevents harm, harassment, bullying, abuse, and neglect. Organizational safeguarding is further concerned about being ready to respond safely and in well at the events of any hazard. Everyone in the organization has a role to play. So all of us on this call have a role to play in safeguarding, which should as well become part of our day-to-day activities. Every organization that delivers charitable activities, social activities, every organization that works with beneficiaries has a duty to safeguard their workers, their volunteers, the beneficiaries themselves, as well as their donors. Generally, safeguarding systems and practices play an important role in protecting employees and stakeholders from harm. Due to varied reasons, including complacency, this safety net has weakened and in some instances completely broken. In dealing with safeguarding issues in the development sector, where I work I've been working for the past, who knows, years, the most recurring malady is for organizations to treat some safety issues as more serious than others. All safeguarding issues need to be taken seriously in all settings and instances. The failure of organizations to involve employees and partners in safeguarding processes make implementation difficult, especially when top management develop these policies and fails to adequately communicate to employees and to provide refresher training from time to time. And this makes it difficult for employees to understand these procedures and policies and to adhere to them. So when there's a top-down approach, it becomes difficult for people to really accept and embrace these policies that has been set in place for employees. It is unfortunate that many organizations pretend to have safeguarding policies by having a nominal one which only exists on paper. The reason to do safeguarding are well quite simple and evident. We all know abuse, harassment, and harm can happen to anyone. It can happen to the people we work with, staff or volunteers that support us, And this issue is not always visible and often spoken about. We also do know that abuse, harm, and neglect are wrong, and we have a duty to do something about it as an organization. When everyone understands safeguarding and their right to be safe, people who have nowhere to turn to are protected. An organization that does safeguarding well is an organization that is trusted. Aside from preventing danger, it should also aim at being ready to respond safely. And what if there's a problem that organization was unable to prevent? So organization needs to put mechanisms in place whereby people can freely feel comfortable to report incidences of abuse of safeguarding issues. In ensuring a safe working environment for all, organization and employees need to understand that safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. The principle in safeguarding ensures the protection of health, well-being, and human rights of individuals, which allows people, especially minorities and vulnerable groups, and these are the people that development workers always work with, interact with, and we try to support them. We have to do this so that they can live free from abuse, harm, and neglect. There are several principles of safeguarding, but for the purposes of this program, I'm going to touch on a few. When you safeguard, you empower people and you support people and encourage them to make their own decisions and inform consent. It is also good to prevent. Like we all say, it is better to prevent than to cure. So it is better to take action before the harm occurs. Protection, that is supporting and representing for those in greatest need. Partnership, as development workers, as people who are working with the most vulnerable and minority communities, it is important to collaborate with other people so that we can play a role in preventing, detecting, reporting, neglect, and abuse. Also, it's part of our accountability. It is very important to be accountable and transparent in safeguarding practices. My organization is a multicultural one with diverse background, origins, political belief, gender, ages, sexual orientation, and physical abilities. Our programming activities and everyday interactions are enriched by our acceptance of one another. And we strive to learn from each other in an atmosphere of positive engagement and with mutual respect. WUSC, which is World University Service of Canada, is committed to preserving a workplace that is free from all forms of harassment, discrimination, and violence, in which all individuals are valued, respected, and treated with dignity. It is my hope that this webinar will help us share knowledge on how we can collectively deal with issues of mainstreaming safeguarding systems and practices within our organization. I wish everyone a fruitful discussion. And with this remark, I duly declare this forum officially open. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Clara. Very insightful words and perfectly setting the stage for our discussion. If you are just joining us, let me just drag out some of the very interesting points which she made. One was that it is the duty of organizations to protect all the people who are in contact with them. And also safeguarding should involve everyone within the organization, not just top management, but all the employees as well. And also the importance of setting systems in place to ensure that safeguarding is carried out across board. Thank you so much once again, Clara. Without much ado, I want us to move into the main presentations for today. And all our participants and listeners on board, do note that questions, comments, contributions are welcome. The text and chat pane is ready for you. We have a team of experts who are ready to respond to any issues that you may have while the speakers are speaking. But afterwards, there will be opportunity for you to unmute and voice your questions and contributions if you would like to do so. We have two speakers for today. and they are both of PDA stock. Our first speaker is Mr. Zayan Imoro. He is a familiar face because he was a former staff of PDA, where he was leading the Advocacy and Communications Unit. In this role, he had opportunity to work in several projects, particularly with regards to child protection, safeguarding, and then school governance reform. And so currently, he is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, and he is also an independent development consultant with a special focus on governance reform and social protection. You're very welcome, Mr. Imoro. Zayan.
Thank you very much, Asira, for that wonderful introduction. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Let me introduce our second speaker as well. Her name is Ms. Victoria Ampia, and she is currently a senior project officer at Participatory Development Associates. She's had a lot of experience in both qualitative and quantitative research, but apart from that, she also has a host of practical adventures on the field in designing and implementing projects, especially with regards to organizational safeguarding, livelihood empowerment for marginalized groups. And she is also the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Lead for PDA's partnership with the Mastercard Foundation under the Impact Partner Organization project. So you're very, very welcome, Victoria and Zayan, and I'll hand over to you now for your presentation. Thank you.
Asira, thank you very much once again for that introduction. When I was listening to Clara give the introductory remarks, I just felt like she's captured almost everything that we've put together to discuss today, but I'll still do my best to cover what I can. Victoria and I will just cover general issues of safeguarding, specifically organizational safeguarding. And we'll delve much deeper into PDA's experience within the safeguarding space, the work that PDA has done so far, and more importantly, the kind of systems that PDA has developed over the years to be able to support organizational safeguarding within different organizations in terms of, one, developing safeguarding structures, two, for organizations that already have existing safeguarding structures, trying to strengthen those, and number three, which is the most important element of it, trying to mainstream those and then practicalize them, because like Clara rightfully mentioned, it makes no sense to have safeguarding structures in place when you're not properly implementing these or when they have not been properly mainstreamed within the institution. So these three key things are important, and those are the sort of systems that PDA has built over the last couple of years in working with organizations within the safeguarding space. So if you have any questions as the presentation is going along, please feel free to, drop your comments in the chat box and then we will respond. And also there will be opportunities for questions and answers at the end of the presentation as well. Sometimes I tend to speak fast, so if I do, you can just lift your hand or whatever it is, and then I'll try to slow down as much as I can. So yes, I think we'll start at this point.
Inclusive system. Why?
Galo, if you can move the slides, please.
Thank you, Zai. I'm sorry to interrupt, but please, just a reminder to all our participants, do remember to mute your microphones until the end of the presentations when there's opportunity for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Asira. So like I said earlier, we'll speak generally about issues of organizational safeguarding. Specifically, we'll talk about, why they need to safeguard, who needs safeguarding, different types of abuse, and so on and so forth. When we're going into specific measures of safeguarding, we'll talk about the minimum standards that organizations can and should put in place within their organizations. And then we'll go through the different types of policies and then what has been in place so far. And then we'll go on to talk about PDA's experience. Like I said, most of the content of this presentation today is informed by practical experience on the ground, working with organizations within the safeguarding space. I think around 2020, 2021, 2022, Victoria and I co-led a safeguarding support project for the Mastercard Foundation, where we had to support about 17 or so organizations to develop and then mainstream safeguarding systems and structures within their organizations. For some of them who already had safeguarding systems in place, it was basically about strengthening these, introducing some new policies, going through reviews, etc. And for those that didn't have the policies at all, and even systems in place, most of those were startup companies. So we had to conduct a needs assessment for them before going forward to start to develop some of those safeguarding systems, and then going further to help them mainstream and implement these within their organizations. So to start from the basic point, safeguarding is essentially protecting someone or something from harm, damage, or abuse, just based on appropriate measure. It's used synonymously with the word protection, but then it's a much more broader, it entails much more broader issues, just because you have issues of response as well. Protection has to do basically with preventing the thing from happening, but with safeguarding, there's a much more broader umbrella that covers much general issues. So as I go much deeper into organizational safeguarding structures, you'll get to understand this more. So organizational safeguarding is simply the responsibility that an organization has to put in place measures to protect people that come into contact with the organization. And such people can range from employees to volunteers, customers, clients, contractors, and even the employer themselves. If there's structures in place that, ensure that everybody is protected, you, the employer yourself, are also protected or is also protected. So it's for the benefit of everybody that you need to have safeguarding structures in place. Next slide. Now, why safeguard? A number of reasons. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you need to put in place safeguarding measures, but for the purposes of this webinar, I'll touch on 4. The first one is issues of vulnerability, right? Now, in every organization, there's definitely power imbalance. You have your employer or, people higher up the organizational hierarchy or ladder who definitely have more authority or power than people who are lower up that chain. Definitely the power dynamic affects the way people interact or engage within that organization. There's also issues of social, discrimination. There's issues of marginalization, poverty, and then disability, among others. If you have people that cannot effectively, protect themselves or care for themselves, it's the responsibility of the organization to ensure that such people are protected. Then there's also the issue of, children, youth, and adults at risk. With adults at risk, we're talking about adults who, for one reason or another, this may be disability, illness, or for whatever reason, cannot adequately protect or take care of themselves. Those also, they also need to be protected, and as well as children that come into contact with organizations, whether it's just coming to visit a parent or a relative with the organization, or it's an organization that's having an outreach program that has to do with children or whatever it is, these children also need to be protected. And safety and protection at the workspace. I'm sure most of us here are employed and we work with different organizations. We want to know that the organization that we're working with has put in place measures to protect us, and then these measures have been well enforced. Just in the sense that you don't want to get up in the morning and then be going to work. You don't want to get up in the morning, going to work, and then you're not happy because you don't feel safe in this workspace. You feel like, there's always an opportunity for somebody to take advantage of you, to try to harass you, or to say something that may make you feel uncomfortable in one way or another, or to try to hurt you in any way. So it's only right that we want to come to work in the morning in safe spaces. I don't know if some of you will remember, but some years back, those in Ghana, for example, some years back, there was an incident in Mawako where one of the senior staff officials, I think, shoved one of the employees' heads onto some, blended pepper that was on the table. And then it caused a whole lot of, media rancor. And then these things happen in a lot of organizations. And this was just one of the few things that came into the limelight and then started raising some of these discussions. So it's important that when you work within an organization, there's that mindset that the organization is protecting you and is keeping you safe. It's just a thing where justice is not just done, but it's seen and appears to be done as well. And also the 4th issue is about, just raising awareness about the need for staff, partners, contractors, just to participate in detecting and reporting issues of abuse. Next slide. Yeah, we can move on from this one. Okay, so I'm going to talk here generally about issues of abuse and then the types of abuse that can occur within the workspace, and then just to make it a lot more specific. And also, it's not just the workspace as well. We also have, even in institutions like schools and whatever other institution, there's the need for safeguarding within these spaces. I think PDA has also done some work regarding safeguarding and child protection in schools as well. So the first type of abuse is physical, and then this is a lot more common, and it's a lot more obvious. So, hitting somebody and, causing physical or inflicting physical pain on the person. When such abuses happen, I mean, depending on the intensity of such an abuse, there might be evidence of it, and then it'll be easy when you report for such things to be detected and to be seen and so on and so forth. So this is a much more obvious form of abuse. Next slide, please. Then we have emotional abuse as well. Some of these comes from like, insults and, just sometimes it's just based on the things that you say to people, the way that you approach people, and then sometimes how you treat people in meetings and in general discussions in the workplace, right? Sometimes, so there's two main things to note here. Sometimes you're not aware of the way that your actions might lead to emotional abuse for some people, and then sometimes it's deliberate in that sense. Either way, I think the organization has to be clear about its rules and regulations and its structures in order to prevent some of these things from happening, and in order to set things clear so that people can easily also respond to such situations when they do occur. You are having a meeting, you have an idea, you shoot it up, and your boss just says, that's a very stupid idea. Something like there's a way that you communicate and there's a way that you approach these things that's appropriate for a professional work setting, rather than using certain words that might discourage people from wanting to share ideas and so on and so forth in the future. It might also be, just cracking a joke with a friend and then saying something derogatory about them based on where they're from, based on their skin color, or just based on any other social issues that might not necessarily be appropriate for such a professional setting, or even in other social settings as well. And then we can move on. Well, there's also generally bullying, which can also entail both physical and emotional abuse at that level. Let's move on. Then neglect. Now, this form is a lot more, it's a lot more subtle to a certain extent, and depending on the organization, sometimes can even go unnoticed. So, for example, you're in a workplace, and then for one reason or another, all of a sudden your boss is no longer giving you the kind of information that you need to be able to do your work. You are being sidelined in major decision-making, which your role actually requires you to be informed about, or to know about, or to participate in, and so on and so forth. It's definitely happened for some of the organizations that we worked with in the past, where probably somebody reported an issue of, sexual harassment, involving their boss. And the next thing you know, the boss starts sidelining them in meetings, starts not taking their responses seriously, giving them less work to do. Essentially, you become somewhat redundant in the workplace. That sort of neglect does happen, and it has emotional impacts on you, but at the same time, it has impact on the kind of work that you have to do within that workspace. So these are sort of things that Safeguarding also seeks to protect from happening within the workspace, or even if it happens, put in place measures to be able to respond to some of these things. Let's move on. Then sexual abuse and harassment, which is also something that's, two things, especially in Ghana, in a lot of spaces, and then based on some research that has been done, it is quite common, especially just the general issue of, remarks with sexual undertones in it, or obvious remarks, sometimes, inappropriate touching, etc. And in many organizations, just because of the issue of, lack of jobs and so on and so forth, people are scared to speak up about some of these things. And even within organizations that do have policies and structures that seek to prevent some of these things from happening, because of the lack of enforcement, people don't want to report, because the same person that you're supposed to report the case to is the same person that's, perpetrating this abuse or harassment against you. So how are you going to go about it? And you dare not go to the police, because that's how you lose your job. And sometimes too, it's even a question of whether or not you'll be taken seriously at some of those levels. So these are some of the things that Safeguarding also seeks to, prevent from happening and adequately respond to when it does happen. So now, the core issue when it comes to putting in place safeguarding structures within an organization has to do with the minimum standards, the basic minimum standards for safeguarding. There's 4 basic minimum standards, and then these have been informed by the work that we've done with these other organizations over the past, and it's also just based on existing literature and then information on safeguarding, generally speaking. So the first one has to do with awareness. How do you create awareness around safeguarding issues so that every staff is aware, and then whoever comes into contact with the organization is clearly aware about some of the issues that the organization seeks to prevent from happening and is clear about standards of operation? The first thing is your safeguarding policy. Every organization needs to have a safeguarding policy in place that clearly stipulates roles and responsibilities of everybody in terms of engagement, how you conduct yourself professionally within the workplace, and how you relate to other colleagues, and how you also relate to your superiors, as well as how you relate to people that might not necessarily be employed by the organization, but that are also visiting the organization. For example, if you work for a research company that frequently goes out to communities and etc. to talk to people, to collect data, safeguarding policies have to be clear about how as a researcher, when you're on the field, you have to be engaging with these communities, because whatever activities or actions that you undertake within those communities has an impact on the organization that you work for, and also has an impact on yourself and your image as well. So it's important for the safeguarding policy to clearly set out some of these, behaviors, and then appropriate conduct so the staff are clear. There's also the issue of the code of conduct, other related policies such as the whistleblower policies, so that when people see certain abuses occurring, they can be able to report it without necessarily being scared that the fact that they've reported this thing would also lead to them being victimized in one way or another, within that work setting. So there's an issue of awareness. Now, when you put in place these policies, how are you going to make everybody aware? That's where you start with, things like staff inductions. When you have new staff that come into that, join the organizations, when you have orientation for these staff, you have to inform them about the safeguarding policy. And I think Clara spoke about this in her introductory remarks. You also have refresher courses for staff almost every year. So I know some organizations that even try to do this sometimes twice a year. You can even do this on a departmental level based on the peculiar needs of the departments. If you have departments that are more people facing, and have to, for example, in banks and things like that, if you have departments that are more people facing, then it means that you need to be reminding these people often as to how they're supposed to be engaging with customers and clients, etc., appropriate language to use, and so on and so forth. So it's just how you constantly, create a space where there is that awareness. You walk into some companies, there are leaflets and things and so on that's clearly state out, code of conduct. Some actually go to the extent of, printing down some clear rules and regulation and putting it up on walls at various places within the organization. So awareness is one of the critical components. It's not just that those laws and policies should exist, but then staff are also supposed to be clearly aware about these. The next minimum standard is the issue of prevention. How do you prevent, abuse from occurring? Part of the issues of prevention come into the awareness part. If you raise awareness, number one, on the kind of things that the company seeks to avoid from happening within the workplace, and you are clear about the kind of sanctions that will follow people who perpetrate some of these acts, some of these things might serve as deterrent mechanisms so that people do not seek to engage in those things or to perpetrate them. However, there's also extra steps that the organization can take. For example, safe recruitment practices. That has to do with your background checks. If you are in the process of employing somebody, it's important for the organization to spend time conducting background checks on the person. Some of these can do with police reports. It's sometimes even going online to search. I think there's an example I was giving about an event that we're organizing, somebody being part of the event, and then, it later on emerged that the person had been involved in a sexual assault case, etc., that was still being in the process of being resolved, and so on and so forth. So sometimes even when you do a simple Google search on the person and then try to go through the different information that you find either on social media, etc., it gives you a fair idea. But that doesn't mean that you believe everything that you find. You also have to do your due diligence as an institution to be able to ensure that the information that you find is credible. So you can do your background checks if there's a need to reach out to extra people. So that's why references are important. For example, you need to get references from people to be clear that, okay, this person has worked in A, B, C, D organization, and working with these organizations, this is the report that the people that they've worked with have about them, and so on and so forth. So sort of those character references are very important in some of these processes as well. Gad, where are the slides? But I will still move on as they're still waiting on them. So now that's the prevention training, and then the effective enforcement is important. Then we also have the issue of reporting systems and then procedures within the organization. So you have your safeguarding policy, you're trying to make people aware of some of these things, and then so on and so forth. It's important to also put in place measures that allow people to effectively, report things. And then, so number one is the structures, the laid down structures and procedures for reporting these cases. People should know that these are the channels through which they can report issues when the issues arise. And then there should be multiple channels through which they could report the issues. So that, for example, if your boss is one of those channels and then your boss is the person that you want to report, for example, you don't have to go to your boss. You can go to somebody else to go and report. Now, the channel should also be in multiple forms. There should be verbal forms of reporting, and then there should also be documented forms of reporting. Some people might be comfortable, speaking about the experience and whatever happened to them, and some people might be much more comfortable documenting such experiences. All of these channels should be available. You should also give the opportunity for anonymous reporting. This is controversial in the sense that some people might take opportunity for this to report frivolous cases. And then when I say frivolous cases, just meaning that not necessarily cases that didn't happen, but just cases in order to impugn somebody's name and so on and so forth. So these are also realities that the organization needs to take into consideration. And then you should also provide appropriate sanctions for people who take advantage of safeguarding systems in order to impugn other people's character and so on and so forth. So number one, you need to have laid down procedures for reporting. You need to have multiple channels, multiple people through which the cases could be reported to, and then multiple ways of reporting. You could have verbal reporting, you could have anonymous reporting, and you could also have clearly documented reporting via emails and so on and so forth. And appropriate response system, that's where investigations come in. You should definitely have a safeguarding team in place, which would definitely involve the people that are part of the channels of reporting, but also depending on the specific case that's involved, you can set together a specific team to be able to do these investigations. If the organization realizes that this case that has been reported is beyond them and then they want to involve law enforcement, then they should involve law enforcement and they should follow up very strongly so that law enforcement can also be able to do their due diligence in their jobs in terms of the investigation aspects. Sanctions should be clearly set out in the safeguarding policies and in the code of conduct so that everybody is clear about it, so that you know that if you undertake this particular action that the company has prevented you from undertaking through those laws and whatever it is, these are the sanctions that would follow, undertaking those activities, etc. So when you lay them out, and then when somebody violates it, and after your investigation, you find the person culpable, and then you decide to go ahead and then met out those sanctions, there wouldn't be any controversies anywhere. So these are just the basic minimum standards for safeguarding. At this point, I'll hand over to my colleague Victoria, who will take you through PDA's experience and then touch more about what the work that we did with the organizations that we work with, the safeguarding systems that we help them in terms of developing, and then also strengthening, as well as how we work with them to implement those structures. We also put together, the safeguarding dashboard, and then a self-monitoring and evaluation tool that allowed companies to periodically assess their own safeguarding structures and then monitor and see their progress in those developments. The dashboard allowed us to also be able to monitor and track progress in developing these systems over time. So Victoria will delve much deeper into some of those systems and then provide clarity. And then at the end, we'll answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Zion. So one important fact to note about safeguarding consent is to make the victim or the survivor the center of whatever investigation you are doing. Their rights and their needs should be prioritized in investigation, safeguarding consent. Then again, you have to speak to witnesses and accused to ascertain facts. So in this case, when you receive a safeguarding consent, both the accused and the victim should be prioritized, because it could be that the case is true or it is not true. So in whichever way you look at it, you need to safeguard the rights of both parties as well. Then who should also conduct this investigation? So every organization should have a system in place and who is responsible for what, just like Diane rightly mentioned. Then where the cases are beyond the organization, you need to make referrals. It is very ethical for organizations to also make referrals to appropriate authorities as well. Next slide. In ensuring effective safeguarding, or these are some of the key things to bear in mind if you want to have an effective organizational safeguarding. One is zero tolerance for bullying, sexual exploitation, abuse, and sexual harassment. And this should be the center of each organizational safeguarding system. It should also form part of your policy statement. By policy statement, that is what you are saying you are committed to. So you should have, or you should declare in your safeguarding policy that so-and-so organization has zero tolerance for bullying, sexual exploitation, and abuse. So that anybody who signs onto the policy is aware of your stance on some of these infringement or breach in contract. Then the next thing is protecting children, sensitization and clearly set out procedures. It should be clear that this and this is what you as an organization have set out for protecting children. And all your staff should be aware of these things. There shouldn't be any ambiguity when it comes to procedures to protect children. Then again, we also have adults at risk. When you talk about vulnerability in the previous slides that we mentioned, you realize that vulnerability changes. Anybody can be vulnerable at any time, depending on where you find yourself. So when you also have to protect adult at risk when you're working within communities, then the protection of whistleblowers and victims of abuse should also give an indication of whether the organization has an effective safeguarding system or not. What procedures are in place to make sure that staff within the organization who blows the whistle or who raise issues of concern, their job is secured, their identity is protected. This will also encourage people to speak up more when they sense a concern or somebody raises a concern of abuse. Then we talk about safer recruitment. Even before people enter your organization, you should have done some background checks. You can also make use of the referees that they put on their CVs to know who exactly is entering your organization. So you don't wait for them to come before you do the background check. So who you admit into your organization speaks a lot about the organization as well. Where have they been to and where are they coming from? Aside that, even when they leave the organization, depending on the reason for their leaving, if they left on the basis of breach of policy or your safeguarding consent, it is important to let that out so that in future they will not come back and the same organization will employ them. Then for safer activities, how are you ensuring that your projects and programs are safe, are respecting the rights and consents of the partners, your employees, and the community within which you work? So you don't wait to implement projects, then you do monitoring or you evaluate whether the project has harmed somebody or not. Right from the designing and planning of the project or program, you ask yourself, how are we protecting the rights of the people we are going to interact with? Or to what extent is this project not going to cause harm to the participant that we are going to engage with? So safeguarding should be at the forefront of every activity an organization decides to embark on. So you should start from the planning stage throughout to the monitoring and evaluation stage. Another important point to note when ensuring effective organizational safeguarding is information recording or data protection. When you go to the field and you collect data from respondents, how do you store the data? Who is in charge of managing the data to ensure that the data does not, you don't find the data anywhere? Organizations have the right to publish pictures or images or even information they collect from the field, but it should be done in a particular way that the rights and the dignity of the people that you collect the data from are protected and respected as well. So even beyond the field work or even beyond the evaluation that you do, how do you ensure that the people you recruited to collect the data present whatever they have to the organization? It is the organization's property. So beyond that, how are you ensuring that you don't find certain aspects of the data on social media and people using certain bits to support their own personal points or ideas that they want to spell out? So it is important for the organization to have this system in place to make sure that people that you recruit or people that you use for your projects, their rights and dignity are protected. Another key important thing is organizational culture. Organizational culture, what do we mean by organizational culture? Next slide, please. It basically spells out the principles, the underlying values that the organization holds dear. So it describes who the organization is, the personality of the organization. For instance, when we say PDA, who is PDA? What are some of the beliefs and values and practices within PDA? And because culture is dynamic, no two organizations have the same culture. So the kind of organizational culture you have would also determine how easy or challenging it will be to mainstream safeguarding within your systems. It is the foundation on which an effective safeguarding system is built and practiced. So instilling an effective safeguarding culture calls for organizational change that is developed together with employees. There is always this saying that, oh, this is how we do things. That says a lot about the culture of the people. So in you saying this is how we do things, how are you also protecting the rights of people? And because organizational culture, people come to meet the culture and they imbibe the culture and they do things just the way they came to meet others do it. Leadership is very important when it comes to organizational culture. People look at leaders, they emulate what leaders do, then they also follow suit. So as a leader, looking at your organization, what are some of the things that is happening within the organization that you feel that it is causing harm to people? What are some of the power imbalances within the organization? Mostly when you talk about safeguarding, it also arises when there's power imbalances between people. And that is inevitable. For instance, the role and the position or the educational status of people within the organization can put them in will give them more power than others. So those with less power are likely, their rights are likely to be infringed or they are likely to be abused. So how do you make sure that, yes, we have that hierarchy of leadership in place? At the same time, they are not abusing their power and authority to make sure that those with lesser power are still able to work effectively, support the organizational goals and visions as well. So if you realize that the organization, the value or the culture does not support safeguarding, you need to take active steps to effect organizational change. And this requires you reflect on the power dynamics within the organization. Then you also take a top-down approach where you engage leadership, from leadership to the least person in the organization. It could be the cleaners, it could be the drivers. You don't leave them out, because you have to collectively design a safeguarding policy. If not, it will get to a point where people will not understand what you mean by this is our culture or this is what you have to do to protect people. So a collaborative effort of participation of different people within the organization is key in developing an effective organizational culture that is also safeguarding what's sensitive and responsive as well. So policies and they are not sufficient to guarantee safer organizations. Moving on, we would also like to share some experience I've had as an organization with you concerning supporting different organizations build effective safeguarding systems. So one of the things that we did was to conduct a needs assessment for organizations, just to understand some of the gaps and the strength that organization has in terms of safeguarding. Then we also reviewed and co-developed existing policies into comprehensive safeguarding. Then we made use of the monitoring dashboard like Zion mentioned. In safeguarding needs assessment, what we did was to give a self-administered audit tool to organizations. So we deployed this self-administered tool for them to be able to tease out some of the systems within the organization according to a particular checklist you gave them. So for instance, looking at your safeguarding policy or your code of conduct, whatever policy you have in place at that moment, how are you ensuring the protection of people you interact with? How do you do background checks on your staff before you recruit them? So all these things helped us to be able to understand the specific needs of each organization that we engage with. Then the next one was to review the existing policies that they have in place. Some had policies, others didn't. So those who already had some sort of policies, we look at the policies to see, what are some of the things that can be added on to make it a comprehensive safeguarding policy, or what can be changed? How do we tailor-make to suit their goals and their aims, or the kind of activity that. The last one was benchmarking and monitoring, just to measure the processes or how the organization is progressing towards designing a comprehensive safeguarding against the minimum standards and the checklists that we design as well. The next one. Okay. So the second thing was reviewing and co-developing existing protection policies into comprehensive safeguarding document and system. So one of the ways we did that was to support them with safeguarding checklists, like I mentioned, a sample risk register. The risk register helps organizations to be able to grade or, to some extent, tease out some of the different activities that has potential to cause harm to their steady participant or beneficiary of their project. So each project comes with its own risk register. Because projects are different and the participant or the focus can be different, it's important to design one for each of the projects that you are embarking on, so that you don't have like one generic risk register that runs through all your projects. Then another thing we did to also strengthen the capacities of organization in terms of safeguarding was to design tailor-made trainings for their focal persons within the organizations. So with this, what we also conducted some short needs assessment to ask them what are some of the things that they are lacking that they would need us to also focus on in the training. This helped us tease out some of the important areas or the gaps that some organizations will need support with. So we met with each of the organizations separately because the needs are also different, to be able to actively address some of these needs. After the training, these focal persons also met with their different organizations and sensitized their staffs within the organization to make sure that the knowledge and the skill of safeguarding is not just limited to the focal person, but trickles down to each other staff within the organization. Then along the line, we also did periodic follow-ups to review their policies and how they are progressing towards having an effective safeguarding system and having a comprehensive safeguarding policy as well. With the needs assessment, we were able to design a monitoring dashboard that helps organizations know the stage that they are. So we have 4 different categories or the spectrum of safeguarding. The first one is safeguarding blind, which is if you score a grade of 0 to 45%, it means you are safeguarding blind. It means you are operating, you don't really know a lot about safeguarding. And basically, people who come into contact with the organization, their rights are not safeguarded. Then the second one is safeguarding basic. It means that at least you have some sort of understanding or you have some system in place to protect people, but that is just at a basic level. Then we have safeguarding sensitive. This is where organizations have like a code of conduct, safeguarding policy, then some sort of grievance mechanisms or whistleblower policy to ensure that people are protected. Then the final stage is safeguarding responsive. This is where you have both measures to prevent and also measures to also address and respond. It is not enough to have a preventive measure. You can't prevent, but what if there's a case of abuse? What do you do? So these two work hand in hand. Safeguarding, prevention alone doesn't mean you are safeguarding or you're having a safer organization. These two have to go hand in hand. So to get to a point where you say you are safeguarding responsive means that your system have both preventive mechanism and also responsive mechanism to protect people. In monitoring the performance of safeguarding policies and structures within the organizations, we also deploy monitoring frameworks to support partners strengthen and mainstream safeguarding in their operation. The monitoring framework was designed on the 4 key minimum standards that Diane talked about. So you ask questions about, let's say if it's awareness or code of conduct. Has all the staff or the partners who come into contact with you signed on to the code of conduct and the safeguarding policy? That is one way to know that indeed you don't just have it in your safeguarding policy, but within your system, you are actually practicing that. When it comes to recruitment, you do background checks on your staff. So here you look at what is actually happening. So we deploy this framework and they also help organizations to know how they are prolonging along the safeguarding journey. Then the final thing we did was feedback, where we interacted with some organizations, depending on the level that they have gotten to along the safeguarding journey, to know how they are, what are some of the challenges that they are facing, what are some of the victories that they have been able to shock along the safeguarding journey. Have they received any concerns? How did they handle it? Just to be able to understood, and the support has been very beneficial to each of the organizations as well. So this was the last engagement we also have with some of the partners that we engage with. What are some of the challenges in developing and implementing safeguarding policy? So if you have in mind that you want to implement a safeguarding policy, what are some of the challenges you are likely to face? And this also captures some of the learnings and experiences we gathered along the line. One challenge that you are likely to face is aligning the organizational values, goals, and activities with safeguarding policy, and also the legislation policies of the country. So this, making sure that these 3 different policies or these 3 different important aspects of safeguarding are in sync. Because if the organizational values are not in line with the safeguarding policy, it will not make people really understand and buy into the ideas of the organization as well. And then again, it is not enough to also have or set out your safeguarding policy outside the legislation policies of the country, which is Ghana. So if you're talking about protecting children, what legislation or policy in Ghana are you committed to? When you talk about ensuring safety of your employees, what of the Labor Act? Is this something that you are paying into organizational culture? Can also be a challenge. because you are trying to introduce something new to the organization. They are already used to a system or way of communicating. So how do you weave the safeguarding culture? For instance, looking at Ghana, mostly most organizations operate on the family and friendship basis, where you can hug people, you can give handshake, you can just give a tap at the back. But in terms of safeguarding, how do you make sure that whilst doing that, people's rights are not infringed upon, or people still feel safe to work? No two people are the same. You can give somebody a tap, you can hug somebody, but somebody may find it unwelcoming. So how do you ensure that people are able to interact freely within the Ghanaian culture or context of the organization, at the same time having respect for the freedoms and rights of people? Sometimes when you interact with international organizations, you realize that the culture is also different from Ghana. It is not, people may not find it funny if you just go and you want to be hugging everybody, but in Ghana, it seems as normal. But that particular culture may not be accepted everywhere. So you need to be very cautious where you are and the kind of culture that you also exhibit. Staff and partners not understanding the importance of safeguarding can also pose a challenge to having an effective safeguarding system and policy in place. That's why I mentioned earlier on that the staff and the staff or the other partners, they need to buy into your safeguarding policy. They need to understand. So you don't design a safeguarding policy and keep it somewhere. Every staff have to have access to that safeguarding policy. That is why it is important to train and reorient staff periodically. You don't train them only once or give orientation, then maybe 2-3 years, you are sure that they've forgotten. Orientation is important when it comes to safeguarding. When you have people coming on board to collect data, during your training, there should be a section where you orient them on safeguarding measures when they go to the field, and what you, the organization, hold dear to your heart, or what you value in terms of safeguarding. Then appointing a safeguarding leader, focal person, staff and partners do not trust. The safeguarding position or the safeguarding lead role is very sensitive, such that if people have concerns, already when people are abused or they have concerns of abuse, they tend to not speak up. So if the safeguard, the person you have appointed there is somebody people already do not trust, then it means that people will not be willing to share or raise concerns, or because already they don't have trust in the person, neither do they have trust in the system. So it is very important to have somebody who is trustworthy, who has a reputation that people can easily approach. Then again, one challenge that we also experience is that when there is frequent labor turnover in the safeguarding lead role, it means that the next person who will come will have to also learn the safeguarding policies and the systems all over again. And anytime it continues to change, people will feel reluctant to even report some of these things because they feel that after all, the person is going to leave anyway. So it is important to have somebody at least who will stay for a period of time and be able to attend to the needs of people. So in addressing some of these challenges, one thing that should run through is that everybody matters in designing and developing a comprehensive safeguarding policy and also implementing safer mechanisms within your organization. Everybody matters because you don't know at what time somebody will be vulnerable. You don't know who is likely to pose a risk to the next person. So your volunteers, consultants bring on board all need to sign onto this safeguarding policy you have, and also have a good understanding of the mechanism in place for people to also raise concern and report issues of abuse. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible both by Zayan and Victoria. And there's just been so much information. It's wonderful. I've been taking loads and loads of notes. Just a reminder that for those who are on call, we are going to have some time for question, answers, and responses and contributions. But so feel free to make use of the chat box. I can see some people already dropping questions in there. For those who are able to register as using the link, we will make available the link to the recording of the webinar as well as the slides that were used so that you can have some time to digest it. But do also follow us on Facebook, PDA Ghana, and on Twitter and also on YouTube at PDA TV so that you can have access to the recordings. All right, so let's get right into the questions. You can either place it in the chat box as others are already beginning to do, or you can raise your hand so that we can give you opportunity to unmute and then ask your question. All right, so let me just kick off with the first question that came in to Zayan and Victoria. And it's asking on whether you can expand on how you implement safeguarding policies across culture, specifically when it protects. How do you make certain men who feel they have the right to treat women in a certain way and they are working with you, how do you make them buy into the whole issue of organizational safeguarding, especially women, without feeling threatened? That's the first question.
So if the person in question is somebody you want to recruit into your organization, that is where at the interview stage, it's important to also explore some of the behaviors of the person. You can also gather information on where the person has previously been and the kind of attitude that the person puts up there. Because once somebody is coming into your organization, then the person has to buy into your policies as well. So even if they come with their own certain ideas or perceptions about how to treat women, they are supposed to lay that aside and also buy into what the organization culture is teaching them. So you have the upper hand to either say you want to recruit such a person or not. So employers have the responsibility to ensure that whoever they bring on board is somebody whose values and ideas align with that of the organization. That is very important. What are their values? Do they align with what the organization is championing? Other than that, if they enter the organization and start exhibiting some of these things, you can start by reorienting the person or providing training for the person. If this doesn't change, then I believe the organization would have to advise itself moving forward.
Just to add to what Victoria said also, I think it also has to do with just the way the laws operate, operational impartiality in terms of the laws themselves, right? So if you, first of all, so there's the example that the leadership within the organizations can set, the way that you behave, the way that you relate with your colleagues and your co-workers will set an example for other people to follow. And whether it's male, female, you definitely see that your boss is not touching women inappropriately. He's not saying certain things to, people in the organization that make them uncomfortable and so on and so forth. Now, secondly, the way that you enforce these laws is also important. If you state in your policy, for example, that somebody is not supposed to touch other people within the workplace inappropriately or touch their sexual body parts, etc. And if somebody does that and then you sweep it under the rug, you create a culture in which people know that, okay, if they do this, it will go on, nothing will be done about it. Now, whoever is the victim would also feel like whatever be the case, if anything happens to them within these organizations, nobody's going to appropriately respond. However, if such things happen and then you take the sanction, if there's a sanction for, say, maybe harassment that has to do with, say, suspension without pay, and then you are effective in enforcing that, it will serve as a deterrent to other people within the organization. So as an example, the leadership can set. That's one, and that sense to build the culture. And then two, when you are effectively enforcing these things, carrying out the sanctions based on the investigations that you've carried out, it also serves as a deterrent to other people within the organization. So there has to be strict enforcement and then, operational impartiality in the way that it's enforced. When person A does it, then you want to enforce the law. And when person B does it, you're like, this guy is good, so let's not really apply the law properly on him. That creates the culture in which, people might feel a bit threatened when other people perpetrate certain acts against them or when they feel victimized by certain people within the organization. So I think effective enforcement is very important in this case. Thank you.
Thank you to both Victoria and Zayan. I do see the hands lifted up. I think we can start with Mark before we get back to the questions in the chat box. So Mark, if you can unmute, we are ready to hear your question.
Okay, thank you so much. I must say this has been a very insightful webinar. I've learned a lot. My question just has to do with having a good policy, a good safeguarding policy. And I'm just wondering, do you have what you would term as maybe an organization in good standing? How their policy is supposed to look like. So do you have something like that, an ideal safeguarding policy that some of us can look at and see in terms of employment, gender equality, harassment, whether sexual, verbal, or emotional? I mean, all the different aspects of safeguarding. If you have a good, ideal policy, some of us would like to take a look at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, for your question. I think there's definitely that. Even so, number one, the safeguarding minimum standards that we discussed are the key and the basic issues that should be captured in every single safeguarding policy. So they're just in terms of, the objectives of the policy, and then the systems in which, or the processes through which the policy is going to be made aware to everybody, and in terms of refresher courses, etc., prevention mechanisms, and then avenues for reporting as well as response. Those are the first key things before other things in terms of whistleblower mechanisms and things that come into place. But definitely PDA has structures in place. I think there's a number of policies that were used to, or are still being used to guide organizations that have, safeguarding needs. So if you are, within a particular organization and you think you need safeguarding support, or in terms of just developing a safeguarding policy from scratch, I think if you reach out to Victoria and then the rest of the team, they can definitely support you to put that together.
Okay. To add on to what Zion also mentioned, that is why it's also important to also employ the services of experts to also help you mainstream safeguarding within your organization. So we at PDA have experience in supporting organizations to co-design and develop their safeguarding policies, and also help strengthen it to become safeguard responsive. Guidelines that we have and processes that we will take you through to ensure that at the end of the support process, you have a responsive and sensitive safeguarding policy and mechanism in place to be able to both prevent and also address safeguarding concerns.
All right. Thank you very much for that. All right, back to the questions in the chat box. Ethel wants to know, how did you ensure transparency and honesty when you were assessing the safeguarding practices in partner organizations, especially since opening up about such internal organizational practices can make the organization vulnerable to the assessing organization? So how were you able to ensure transparency and honesty among the partners? I believe this is referring to the Mastercard project that you carried out and you gave your experience on. So,
okay, so for starters, from the onset, it was a bit challenging because every organization wants to be independent from each other. But one thing we did was to engage with them one-on-one. So we didn't have a common session where we call meeting for everybody to meet, aside the introductory section. So we attended to the needs of each organization separately, so that in engaging with them, they will still have the confidence to share. But even at that, sometimes it can be a bit challenging for them to own up or clearly say that this is what we don't have, because sometimes it may look as if they've been operating for a long time, but they don't have certain standards. But we also made them understand that whatever we are doing is for their own benefit. Because one key or important point to note when you have an effective safeguarding is that it makes you attractive to donors as well. Because now every donor wouldn't want to push money into an organization that has a tendency to, or don't have mechanisms in place to be able to prevent and also respond to abuse. So once they get to know this, they know that whatever we are doing is for their own benefit. So it's important to be vulnerable at that stage to let the people leading you or the experts know that this is the areas you are lacking, so that together, we don't just do it for them, but we co-design. So we do it in connection with them to be able to make sure that their system is up to date and is effective as well. So that was how we do that.
Just to also add to what Victoria said. So in terms of the vulnerability aspect, number one, there should be the willingness from the organizations themselves that, okay, we know that it's important for us to develop safeguarding systems, and we actually want to do that. So we are opening up ourselves for support from these organizations that can help us do that. Now, with specific regard to the Mastercard project, yes, there was a contractual obligation from their partner, that was Mastercard, that every organization that it's supporting needs to have safeguarding, systems in place. In a case where the organization, it's not a contractual obligation, but an organization just willingly wants to put in place safeguarding mechanisms, that also makes it a lot easier because there's been, an awareness that they want that. I think secondly, in terms of the practices themselves, the first thing we did was to deploy, when we're doing the safeguarding scan, we deployed a self-assessment tool. So this allowed the organizations themselves to fill out, questions that directly related to the safeguarding systems and practices within their own organizations. What we did after that was to follow up on that based on the answers that they gave us, to have conversations directly with these organizations, like Victoria said, one-on-one. And then part of that, there was a due diligence process where if you say you have ABC systems, we need to verify the ABC systems and be sure that you are not just telling us that you have it, but then these are the policies that you do have. And we also developed a checklist, a system that we use to assess every policy. So be it a code of conduct, be it a safeguarding policy, be it a whistleblower tool, there were about 30 different elements that we had to assess in all of these policies to ensure that they had all these things in place. And this is just in terms of like the documentary purposes of it before we go on to the actual practice within the organization. I think there's a third layer of it that is still in development in terms of how you speak to, where you speak to different people within the organizations to even get to know their own experiences about the safeguarding practices within the organizations that they work with. And mostly, if this happens anonymously, it can actually help give you a better idea of the practices rather than just having senior officials within the organizations give you information about what's happening within these. It might be challenging, it might be tricky, but depending on how you do the engagement, you might get something positive out of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming in as well with your contributions, Zayan. All right, I think we can take Selom and Christopher in turn before we return to the questions in the chat box. So Selom, if you can unmute and ask, and then Christopher as well, so we can take two questions.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. I've learned a lot, but I have two questions to ask. The one has to do with the issue of power play. When we come to development work, some people have power, others are powerless. So in administering the safeguarding to your organization, how should you deal with the issue of power play? Because beneficiaries are vulnerable, they are powerless, the staff, volunteers all have this. So how should you do the issue of power play? And the second question is, so far as the focus is on the staff, volunteers, contractors, and associates, not to do harm to these beneficiary girls. What mechanisms should we put in place to prevent beneficiary abusing the colleague beneficiary? That's my question. Thank you very much. I hope it's clear.
I think so. You're asking first of all about the issues of power play, and then second of all, how to protect beneficiaries from each other, if I'm getting you correctly.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Beneficiary mechanisms put in place that beneficiary will not harm the colleague or abuse colleague beneficiary.
Okay, thank you. So Diane can start. Okay, I want to take.
I think if we can get Christopher to also ask his, and then we can just respond to all at the same time, that will be much better.
All right. Please, can you hear me?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Zayan and Victoria, and then Clara for the massive facilitation. My question is very brief. My first question goes, who drafts the safeguarding policy and how? So who should draft it? Should it be the involvement of all the staffs, including volunteers and all other associates in terms of drafting of the safeguarding policy, or there should be a human resource person who draft, and who plays what roles when it comes to the drafting of the safeguarding policy? And then my second question should be, how often must the safeguarding policy be reviewed? How often? Thank you.
Okay, so I think Zayan, you can just start.
Okay, all right. Let me take a shot at that, and then I think Victoria, you can come in as well. So just in terms of the first question, I think it was twofold. First question had to do with the power play within organizations and just how to manage these things, etc. I think that's part of the main reasons why you need safeguarding within the organization, right? And I think if you have clearly set out rules and regulations of conduct, it's going to be a rule of law system. So you're not going to have different rules for the you're not going to say that, okay, as the boss, you can touch people inappropriately, and as an employee, you cannot touch people inappropriately. It's going to be rules that apply equally to everybody. And that has to do with the operational impartiality of the law itself, that whatever it is that you have on paper should be the same thing that you practice in fact. Now, one of the things that I'm not sure if we touched on it here in terms of developing the safeguarding structure, especially within big organizations, is putting in place a safeguarding team, or depending on the organization, some call it the task force, that has membership across different divides of the organization. So you have 1 or 2 board members of the organization that are also part of this safeguarding task force. You have 1 or 2 members of leadership themselves. Then you have people from the human resource unit that are also part, and other people within the organization as well. So depending on the case, you can form teams that lead the investigation, with specific cases. And you can also have a specific safeguarding officer, or 1 or 2, depending on the size of the organization, that goes through regular training on safeguarding, is very well equipped to be able to undertake some of these investigations, lead the processes. And then more importantly, is somebody who's of good character and upstanding within the organization itself. So if you have that safeguarding task force in place, it definitely ensures that whoever it is, whether the person is a person that has a lot of power within the organization or not, you can definitely be able to manage these things, because it's a task force. It's a group of people that's composed of people across the hierarchy within the organization. So depending on the structures, you can definitely put that in place. In terms of abuse among colleague partners, I'm not sure if you are referring to just broadly, maybe in terms of, for example, if the Mastercard Foundation, for example, in terms of just funding different organizations, and within those, or you're talking about within a specific organization, trying to prevent abuse between maybe lower level employees or just people at the lower level of the hierarchy. Either way,
please let me clarify it all.
Okay, go ahead and clarify.
Okay, so let's say you are implementing a project, and you want to provide these beneficiaries. But what mechanisms should you put in place so that the beneficiary you are helping should not be abusing themselves?
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So I think part of that also has to do with the program risk assessment, as Victoria mentioned. Before you undertake any program, if the potential risk is for abuse, or just be based on the relations of the stakeholders themselves, then you need to be able to capture that. I think one of the first things that you do when you get to the field and when you're working on things like this is to be able to clarify what exactly your role as an institution would be regarding the project, and then how you would resolve some of these things. You should be clear about how you're going to engage the people. One of those would be that if there's a situation that is beyond your power as an organization to be able to intervene or intercede for, then you involve the law enforcement processes. Because if you exit from these organizations, if you exit from the project or whatever it is, these communities that you're working with, the stakeholders in there, they're still going to be engaging with themselves. And it's law enforcement that comes in anytime there's an issue within that. So you should be clear about what's within your remit as an organization to be able to deal with, to be able to resolve, and then what is beyond that, where you'll be able to involve law enforcement. If the issue within the organization or regarding the stakeholders has to do directly with the project that you are enforcing, then it's within your remit to resolve, for example, distribution of resources, etc. And that's something within your power to be able to deal with. So it should be part of your clearly set out guidelines in terms of field engagement and so on. So the moment you first get to the field and you start talking to people in terms of your community introductions, you have to clearly set out, these rules and regulations that will guide your engagements with them, as well as their engagements with each other within the confines of the project. However, if anything occurs outside of those confines or outside of those remedies, then you definitely have to involve law enforcement if it's within your capacity to do so. That's for that. So moving to the next question as well, in terms of who drafts the policy, it has to be an inclusive process. It has to be an inclusive process across the whole organization. So first of all, I think there's a need to do that needs assessment to be clear exactly what your needs are so far as safeguarding. Then moving on from there, you need to do a consultation across the entire organization. Usually, depending on the size of the organization, you can have a specific safeguarding officer or a team of safeguarding experts, a team of safeguarding officers, not experts, that can go into this and then, do the engagement across the entire organization, get feedback from everybody else, get input from everybody within the organization, and you can put together a team that will begin the drafting process. In much more smaller organizations, you have the human resource person that doubles as the safeguarding officer as well. Now, you can, task the human resource officer to put together a team just made up of different people within the organization that will still go ahead to conduct this engagement across the entire organization before moving forward to put together the policy. So number one, it's supposed to, be something that has an input of everybody within the organization. That's clear and sure. Number two, it doesn't necessarily have to be the safeguarding officer who's drafting the policy. For purposes of inclusion, you can also set up an independent team, but needs to have the safeguarding officer involved as well that will lead in the drafting process. Sometimes when you do these things, you can bring in experts and organizations like PDA to help you review this policy, and in terms of just run through an assessment of it to make sure that it cuts across the key and very important issues that have to be captured within safeguarding policies, codes of conduct, whistleblower policies, etc. So I think my answer also just it also touches on your question as to who plays what role. In terms of how often the review should be done, it honestly depends on your organization and the resources that you have. But at best, you can do this every year, and at worst, every 2 years. Thank you. I think, Vic, if you have anything to add, you can come in at this point.
Okay, thank you, Zion. So just a quick one. One key thing to know when it comes to leadership and safeguarding concern is that once a safeguarding concern is brought against a leader, he or she cannot be part of the investigative processes. The person has to be, the investigative procedure should omit him from, it can be very objective in our safeguarding concern. Then again, when it comes to how often can the safeguarding, can the review policy be reviewed, in as much as you can do maybe 1 year or 2 years, I believe as and when something also comes up that needs your attention, you need to also revise the safeguarding policy. Sometimes the challenge is to have everybody present to be able to do that. But I believe one way to also go about that is that most organizations go on retreats where we have staff and seize that opportunity to also revise your safeguarding policy to see if you are still on track. If you need to add something, there's something that you need to change. That organizational culture change can also happen in 3 sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. All right, there's still lots of questions to two from the chat box. The first one is, what is your best practice advice on storing incident and confidentiality? So storing incident reports may interesting one of how do you develop a comprehensive policy to protect people who, especially when those are not even protected by the law of the country. For instance, in Ghana, where LGBTQ community, how do you develop a comprehensive safeguarding policy to cover such persons within your organization?
Well, sure, I'm happy to give a go at it. I didn't hear the other question that you asked, but I'll start with the storing of cases and things, and then Victoria, you can come into another. So the first thing is that when cases are reported, you need to treat it on a need-to-know basis. It's not everybody who has to know about the case, not even everybody within the safeguarding task force. So depending on who the case has been reported to, there must be key people within the safeguarding unit that you inform about the case. And then, like Victoria rightly said, if the person who, so for example, you have maybe a board member who's also on the safeguarding unit, and then the report is made and it's against this person, for example, I mean, first of all, when the report comes in, the team that has to deal with the case must not include this person. And then before you start to put some of these things together. Now, beyond the safeguarding unit as well, nobody else is supposed to know about these cases. So it's going to be treated on a need-to-know basis, and especially when you are conducting the investigations, in terms of maybe say there being witnesses to the event, etc., that you have to invite to ask questions about it. And then the witnesses themselves also have to, sign, confidentiality form, just such that whatever be the evidence that they provide on the case, they cannot go out and then go and be discussing with other people. Because There's also the issue of just general victimization and secondary victimizations after some of these things happen, right? That, just based on the way cases reported and how it's handled, the victim, continues to feel victimized even after the incident has been dealt with, just based on how colleagues within the workspace talk about it and then how they deal with it. I think depending on the organization, you need to have a very secure system of storing and then keeping those information in case files. The human resource department should definitely be able to have, so for example, if there's particular secure emails that you make those reports to, you only have 1 or 2 people that have access to those emails. So then in case any information leaks out, you know exactly how and where the information leaked out from. But most importantly, the information shouldn't even be able to leak out in the first place. That's why the people that are handling these things should be people of, very good character and then high moral standing within the organization. It's not, safeguarding is not one of those roles that you just give to anybody at all, just based on certain level of skills and qualification. It also has moral and ethical implications for it as well. In terms of manual, verbal reportings and all of those things, if you're reporting to such people, then you can definitely be assured to a certain extent, just like, speaking to a therapist or whatever, that these things are not going to go out of the confines of that, unless for purposes of investigation, and they're going to be keeping the names, out of reach of people. So depending on the organization, you definitely need to make sure. So you can have specific emails that you take, safeguarding reporting emails where cases are reported to. That's if you're going through the documentation process. However, if it's going to be verbal as well, whoever it is that's receiving the report has to also be able to note it down and document it on a certain level, just to be able to fast track or to guide the investigation processes at the same time. But then you need to have secure places of keeping these things, just so that not everybody else within the organization can have access to it. And every case should be dealt with on a need to know basis. And I didn't, probably hear the last question, but I think you're talking about how to protect everybody generally within the organization, particularly LGBTQ people and so on and so forth. And I think that's a very important question to raise, just in the sense that your safeguarding policy that you put in place within an organization is not supposed to discriminate in any way, form, or substance. So whatever be somebody's sexual orientation, whatever be their approach, whatever be their beliefs, religious beliefs, and etc., the main issue in there is that so far as they are coming into contact with your organization as a staff, as an employee, whatever, you're supposed to put in place such measures to protect them while they are included in the organization. It is not the organization's responsibility to, be casting, to put in place selective protections based on some of these things. As a matter of fact, depending on the context that you're in, there needs to be explicitly stated consent, especially if there's more targeted attacks or abuse certain people within that organization. The organization definitely has more responsibility to put in place those structures to ensure that those people are well protected. Victoria.
Okay, so on the second question, I think we need to also be clear about what the law states, or though the country frowns on certain behaviors from the LGBTQ, it doesn't in any way also state that their right or their freedom or their life should be taken, or we should cause harm to them. So we have to make that distinction clear. So as an organization, when it comes to safeguarding, we are looking at not causing harm or protecting people from harm and abuse or exploitation. So in whatever you do, it is important to protect the rights of the marginalized group. So even the law of the state doesn't in any way, there are certain behaviors that are frowned upon in the country or that is met with legal action. But at the end of the day, their rights and their freedom to live and also not to cause harm to them is enshrined in the Constitution, as they are all citizens of the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. All right, I see Crystallite and Mark again, whose hands are raised. Perhaps we can take the two of them together once again. Crystallite, you can unmute and then go ahead.
Yeah, hello, good morning. My name is Crystallite from Baguette, Africa. So nice presentation. I've been following from the onset, and I think there's a lot I've learned. But my question is that, would you advise that an organization that has set out its safeguard policies should also put itself under another organization in order to be, in order to also have the safeguarding, let me say, benefits For instance, so in quotes, who watches the watchman? Would you advise that if I am an organization and I've set out my safeguard policies, myself that I've set it out for my beneficiaries or associates, who also gives me that safeguarding? So I want to ask that, would you advise that an organization should enroll under, for instance, maybe PDA, that PDA will also be giving them that kind of, let me say, benefits or that kind of, let me say, yes, so the benefit they need to enjoy. So I just want to ask, would you advise that that should be done? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal. And I think the straightforward answer to your question is yes, not necessarily putting the organization under another organization, but just the, contracting the services of another organization that's are versed in, safeguarding practices, so that they can help you with your monitoring and reviews, and then just helping you probably strengthen certain structures in place. Like you said, if you're going through, maybe if you're having yearly retreats, and then you are using that as an opportunity to review the safeguarding policy and to strengthen such structures, that can be an opportunity to invite those organizations who will be supporting through those processes as well, just to also be able to be part, speak to different staff within the organization, most likely anonymously, just to help, properly assess such systems. And I think as part of what we've actually been doing in PDA, Victoria will also, I think Victoria attested that in terms of just with some organizations actually actively seek, us to join them in some of their retreats and things like that, just to help do a proper evaluation of some of these things. So yes, it's good to contract the services of these organizations, and then you can discuss the modalities of how you want them to be able to support your safeguarding practices within the organization.
So one key principle in safeguarding is accountability. And I believe that the question you talked about too has an element of accountability. You can also do that to make sure that every time there is this check and balance to make sure you are still on track. But sometimes you may not be able to pick up certain concerns or in your organization can easily do that. So it can also help ensure accountability.
Excellent, great stuff. Mark, your hand is up as well. Okay, I'm wondering if I should read one question from the chat box before I hand over to you.
So.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, hi, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question is quite simple. I just want to know, what is your recommendation for an organization that wants to implement anonymous reporting? Because I heard you mention that, and I don't know how an organization can implement that. If you have any recommendations, thank you. Anonymous reporting.
All right. Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark, for that. So, there's a number of ways in which you can go about this. There are some organizations that actually have specific boxes for that kind of reporting, where people actually just write out whatever it is that they want to report. Either you can type it out or whatever it is, and then you drop it in that box, and then whoever is responsible for checking it can, check it in and do that. A second way that you can do that is by third-party reporting. So you can talk to somebody that you trust within the organization to relay the report for you. You know that person would hold your identity confidential throughout the process. But at the same time, also, like I said, the issue with anonymous reporting is that in terms of doing your investigations and your due diligence around it, it places an extra burden on the people that are doing the investigations to be clearly sure about how they're carrying these investigations out. You can understand why sometimes somebody would want to report things anonymously, but at the same time, also because of the need to investigate and hear from everybody that was involved in the issue, it creates a situation whereby it's much more difficult to investigate. But in a case whereby it has to be reported, you can have those boxes so people can easily drop that in, or you can do that confidentially through another person, a third party that you actually properly trust within the organization that can help relay the information to whoever it is that's involved. There's other structures in place that you can put in, but either Victoria can touch on that, or you want to consult PDA specifically for those services too, I think the organization will be happy to help you.
Vic has ceded her contribution back to me. All right, so we've been talking a lot about institutions that are interested in actually setting up safeguarding systems, but there's a question in the chat box from Anthony, who is asking about institutions which are resistant to implementing even the minimum standards of these policies. What do you do for a victim who is struggling or facing safeguarding abuses, would you advise them to leave the organization, or should they seek legal action? And if they do go ahead to seek legal action, to what extent do they get support from organizations like Champion? The question is clear.
Yeah.
All right. So Vic, I think you can start.
Yeah. I believe if an organization is not taking the needed steps to address or protect its employees or beneficiaries from harm, I believe the person can look outside the organization, because we still have laws of the state that each organization which operates in Ghana is supposed to abide by. So should your rights be infringed, or should you feel that there is any potential of harm coming towards you, or you've actually been abused in practice, then what you can also do is to go to corporate authorities. But for us as PDA, I believe we are not in a position to maybe halt or call the organization to order. But I believe once you speak to the appropriate authorities in the country, they will take the case up and do the needful.
Thank you. Zion, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think Vivek has appropriately addressed that question. We can move to other questions as well.
Thank you. There's lots of contributions going on in the chat board, but Kofi, I see your hand up. You can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I think most of the discussions that is ongoing seems to be talking about person-to-person safeguarding. But one of the many things that we ignore is safeguarding of the environment, safeguarding within the working space. Now, most of donors are now also looking at environmental safeguards. So I wanted to pick your opinion on how organizations should look at that aspect of safeguarding, not only person-to-person safeguarding, but also how we safeguard the environment in the working space. We work in organizations where we use a lot of single-use plastic items. People print emails when they are not necessary and stuff. So how do we incorporate all these things when we are preparing such documents? Thank you.
Yeah, so when it comes to designing a safeguarding policy or system, it is important for the organization to understand what you do, your activities. So you can have a lot of sections that spells out specific, attends to specific needs of the organization. So for instance, if you do a lot of things in the area of environment, then it means that there should be a section, or you can even design a separate environmental safeguarding policy to address some of these concerns as well. So thank you for your question. I believe Zion has some.
Thank you very much, Victoria. And thank you very much for that question as well. I think it's just 2 points that I want to raise here. The first is that, yes, what you said is actually quite important. And I don't think it should necessarily be an issue of, donor obligation before an organization starts to think about, environmental, protection and its role in trying to, support the protection of environment in many ways. The fortunate thing is that depending on, the work that most of these development organizations do, part of them don't directly contribute to, environmental waste or anything like that in one way or another, but there definitely is a role that one can play. Number one is you need to identify the priority areas in which you want to contribute to the environment. So for example, if you want to reduce the usage of plastic, materials, for example, then you have to figure out which capture that in your policy and at the same time in your practice. Through examples and so on and so forth. So even the use of, plastic water bottles in the office space and all of those things. If you are getting a dispenser or water filter so that staff do not repeatedly want to, be using the sachet or water bottles. These are just examples that I'm putting across. But I think some of these things will be more, yes, you can capture them in paper, but I think it's definitely more in practice. And then there's also issues of trying to, even waste disposal, which might be a lot more difficult in Ghana, just given the fact that, the big waste disposal companies, for example, some of them do not even have systems of distinguishing between the recyclable waste and the non-recyclable waste. So if you go through that burden of separating the waste, and then they come and pick it up and then they put it all together and then they send this thing, it's basically like, taking you back to the same point again. But if you're going to put those systems in place within your organization, then you need to be clear about how you're going to carry them through. But it's definitely a very important concern that organizations should put in place in terms of safeguarding for the environment as well. And it should definitely also be captured in different safeguarding practices and so on. But we also need to understand the extent to which that's possible within the context in which we find ourselves too.
All right, Richard, you can go ahead as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just to also add a thought in answering the question. I think one other thing that we could also take caution of is within the space in which we work as an organization. So let's take, for example, if an organization that is working with a farmer group, farmers, of course, are tilling the land to produce food and what have you. So if the fiscal land, whatever relationship that you have with this farmer group, has the potential of causing harm to the land, then it becomes a kind of responsibility to see, as far as our safeguarding principles or policy are concerned, what we can put in place to ensure that our relationship with the farmers, or as far as our encounter with the land, do not at the end of the day cause harm to the ecosystem. This is another way that we can look at, because you may not directly, as far as your work is concerned, take cognizance of the environment, but in the context in which you work, if our working practices has something to do with the environment, then it will be important that in our safeguarding policy, as far as the environment is concerned, we put in something there to ensure that our working with the environment do not cause harm or whatever to the environment. This is another bit that we can add. Thank you.
Thank you also very much, Richard, for those contributions. And thank you all. I believe we've covered the questions that were in the chat box. Is there anyone who has any other question or contribution? We still have Clara from WUSC on call. We have Zayan, we have Victoria, and they are ready to answer any questions or take any contribution. Okay, Richard, is your hand up again, or?
Yes. There is this nagging question that has been going on for some time now. Looking at us as Ghanaians and where we are coming from, we still have our culture ingrained in a lot of things that we do. How do we sort of align belief systems and safeguarding? This is my question.
So aligning belief systems, our culture, and safeguarding.
Can you elaborate more on your question? Like, what kind of belief systems are you talking about aligning with safeguarding?
Okay.
Practices?
Maybe I will just use one. Currently, if you look at this conversation around the rights of children. Now, if you look at our belief system, some places there's been belief that the child do not have the space to even assert for his right or whatever. Sometimes you see us demonstrating this in our conduct, though we don't verbalize it within the space in which we find ourselves. Let's come to the working space. Some of us, sorry to go a bit gendered conversation, some of us still have this issue of a woman cannot do this, a woman cannot do this kind of thing. In the midst of some of these things, how do we get safeguarding to become effectual in the working environment as far as our conduct is concerned?
Oh, okay. All right. I think I have more clarity on that now. I think in that sense, it's not necessarily about aligning per se, but it's just basically, developing the organizational culture around around principles and practices that you seek to promote as an organization. So, for example, if you find yourself in a cultural environment, not necessarily within the organization, I'm talking about on a social level where women are not being empowered, that cannot be taken into the work environment where you're trying to build a culture where women are empowered in that sense. So and I think it goes back to the point that I raised before with regards to the first question or so. It has to do, number one, with the example that leadership set within the organization. The example that leadership set within the organization should be in line with the kinds of ethics, with the kinds of principles, and with the kinds of culture that they seek to establish for that organization or frame within that organization. If you're clear in your laws about what exactly, in your policies about what exactly you want to do, and then your actions and leadership, reflects that, then it should also trickle down throughout the whole organization. More importantly, if the policies and the laws that you develop were based on a broad consultation within the entire organization, then at least it should reflect buy-in from everybody else. So it makes it easier for people to be able to follow things that they did. Now, more importantly, in addition to setting an example as leaders, I think it's about the way you enforce such practices and such laws within the organization. I can't stress that enough. If you let things slip by, if you are easily letting things go, you're creating a culture of impunity in which people feel like they can easily keep doing things, and then they can easily shut, maybe, for example, just using your same example, maybe shut women down in meetings when they're speaking and so on and so forth. You create an environment where people keep doing these things because they think it's either okay to do it, or that even if it's not okay to do it, when they do it, nothing is going to be done to them. So number one, yes, the leadership example is very important. But number two, also the way you enforce some of these co-developed laws and policies are very important. Victoria, if you have something you want to add to this.
Okay, so I would like to add that having an effective safeguarding system is a journey. So you learn, you unlearn, and you relearn. Once you know that this is the particular community that we work within, what is their culture? Try to understand their culture. It is only when you understand them that you'll be able to come up with measures to be able to blend or align your safeguarding values with that of their culture. Because you need to win them over. If you really want to protect children, in the example that you mentioned, it is important to understand that particular culture and find ways around educating and creating awareness such that people also buy into your values. So each community is different and each case too is different. So that is what I would say or add on to what I mentioned.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone. All too soon, our time is running out. Wonderful questions.
His ruling was not good at all. So they took him out. They said they were.
All right, sorry about that. Okay, so some of the key discussions have centered around the issue of awareness, creating awareness about issues of systems and policies in place for redress, and creating awareness through and retraining when necessary, all your staff, and getting everyone involved in safeguarding all the people that come into contact with the organization. There's also been the point that justice must be done to offenders within organization, those who break safeguarding rules. And not only must it be done, but it should be seen to be done. Everyone must understand that when you do this, this is the punishment. No matter your position in the organization, no matter how valuable you are in terms of your work. Then also that has dovetailed into the need for building these systems and implementing them intentionally as organizations. And we've really learned a lot from what Zayan and Victoria and Clara, for that matter, have shared. But it may be a bit daunting for first-time organizations who are trying to set up the whole system, even with this informative webinar. So do reach out to us. Our MD, Adam, and Clement are available. You can just send out an email so that we get in touch with you if you would like to engage PDA to help you with setting up systems and practices for organizational safeguarding. So thank you all so very much for being a part of these conversations. The recording and the slides will be made available to those whose email contacts we have from the registration sheet. But just before we end, we want to hear some closing words from Clement. Clement is one of our managers of PDA, that is, and he's been here throughout the call. So Clement, over to you.
Hi, thanks so much, Asada, and many thanks to Zion, who graciously offered to be part of this conversation despite moving on to other things, other equally important stuff. So Zion, good to see you on call. And of course to Victoria and everyone who has contributed today. I mean, from the presentation and the discussion so far, it's obvious that safeguarding policies can be difficult to establish and implement, especially because to have a safeguarding policy means to have a horizontal and vertical impact across the board, touching on management and staff. And it's also about attitudes and behaviors which are difficult to manage in the context of culture, which one questioner will not try to ask, that those things usually go against the tides of safeguarding in organizations. So obviously navigating the power imbalances there can be critical but useful. I guess the point here is that safeguarding cannot be but useful for organizational growth and prestige, because there are also benefits, in establishing it and showcasing it to funders and other implementing partners. Our commitment at PDA has definitely been to showcase the value of such policies in Ghana and the sub-region. And that's why we thought that this webinar is pertinent, important, getting the word across and also demonstrating that it's feasible despite the challenges of establishment and implementation in Ghana and in many other developing countries. At PDA, we are very much committed to knowledge creation and dissemination. And so this is just one of our webinar series we have in place. Every quarter, we now have a knowledge production and dissemination webinar series. Today's is for this quarter. There will be another one in the next 3 months or so. Do watch out and attend as well. I think obviously today's participation shows that the choice of the topic today is very useful, pertinent, and relevant. And that's what we know how to do best at PDA. And definitely the next topic will be useful as well. So do watch out for the next one and come along and ask all those very important questions and engage. And definitely you would leave such webinars with very useful things, take home points. Probably today our take home message can be around the 5 minimum standards of safeguarding, which if I have to recap in a very crude way, I mean, Zion and Victoria and Zion have done a very great job. But so having a policy statement on safeguarding is very useful as a minimum standard if you want to really be an organization that enhances safeguarding of staff. The second point is, after having a policy statement, to create awareness about it, to protect the most vulnerable members of the organization, to be aware. Protection is very important because then people know they are safe and well and well protected. But beyond protection, there has to be prevention as well, prevention of abuse. But that also means even before recruitment, people's backgrounds will have to be checked, and then those who are staff have to be made aware and comply with those policies. The fourth minimum standard that has well been articulated by Vic and Zion is putting reporting systems in place so people can report both anonymously if they prefer it that way, or to name and shame publicly if they don't feel safe in the organization. Then the final thing that has to happen is that if there's a report, there has to be investigations and enforcement of sanctions when these things happen. And so these 5 minimum standards are like the sine qua non, that without which there can be no safeguarding. And I'm sure that point has been hammered down very well already. And we hope you found today's sessions useful, and please reach out via social media platforms. I think our team is very responsive, and whoever has sent us a message, even via Facebook, has found that they have been responded to quickly without any delay. So reach out on our social media platform, Facebook. I think someone shared those links on our chat comment box there. You can also just check our website, www.pdaghana.com, which I think, yes, Asada just posted them there as well. Yeah, check out and let's have a chat. If you need us to have further conversations, whether to collaborate on anything, or you just need any thoughts, reflections, any advice on anything at all, just reach out and let's talk. Yeah, look, I think I've spoken longer than I was allowed to. Let me hand over now to you, Asada, to officially close the session. So thanks everyone for coming. It's been a very wonderful session. And thanks so much again, Victoria and Zion.
Thank you indeed. Thank you, Clement, also for your remarks. And thank you all for being with us and being here. So we'll be in touch with the slides and the links to the recording. And of course, we are always ready to hear you if you want to reach out to us. Have a wonderful rest of the day and weekend, and look out for our next webinar, which will be as engaging and informative. Have a blessed weekend. Bye.
Thank you, Asada. Thank you, Vic. Thank you, Clement. Bye, everybody.